So hello everyone, this is group 7 and we are going to discuss dialectical tradition. Before we proceed with discussing the dialectical traditions for the perspective of the other philosophers, let's first understand what is dialect or dialects. So dialect, also known as the dialectical method, is a discourse between two or more people holding different points of view about a subject but wishing to establish the truth through reasoned argumentation. For Hegel's dialects, which George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, um, he said on his perspective, dialects is a term used to describe a method of philosophical argument that involves some sort of contradictory process between opposing sides. So, um, in what is perhaps the most classic version of dialects, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, for instance, presented his philosophical argument as a back and forth dialogue or debate, generally between the character of Socrates on one side and some person or group of people to whom Socrates was talking, his interlocutors, on the other. In the course of the dialogues, Socrates' interlocutors proposed definitions of philosophical concepts or express views that Socrates challenges or opposes. The back and forth debate between opposing sides produces a debate between opposing sides produces a kind of linear progression or evolution in kind of linear progression. Oh, I'm sorry. Um, in philosophical views or positions. As the dialogues go along, Socrates' interlocutors change or refine their views in response to Socrates' challenges and come to adopt more sophisticated views. The back and forth dialect between Socrates and his interlocutors thus becomes Plato's way of arguing against the earlier, less sophisticated views or positions, and for the more sophisticated ones later. So Hegel's dialects refers to the particular dialectical method of argument employed by the 19th century German philosopher Hegel, which, like other dialectical methods, relies on a contradictory process between opposing sides, whereas Plato's opposing sides were people and Socrates and his interlocutors. However, what the opposing sides are in Hegel's work depends on the subject matter he discusses. So, in his work on logic, for instance, the opposing sides are different definitions of logical concepts that are opposed to one another. In the phenomenology of spirit, which presents Hegel's epistemology of philosophy of knowledge, the opposing sides are different definitions of consciousness and of the object that consciousness is aware of or claims to know. Note that although Hegel acknowledged that his dialectical method was part of a philosophical tradition stretching back to Plato, he criticized Plato's version of dialects. He argued that Plato's dialects deals only with limited philosophical claims and is unable to get beyond skepticism or nothingness. So, according to the logic of a tradition, reductio ad absurdum argument, if the premises of an argument lead to a contradiction, we must conclude that the premises are false, which leaves us with no premises or with nothing. We must then wait around for new premises to spring up arbitrarily from somewhere else, and then see whether those new premises put us back into nothingness or emptiness. Once again, if they too lead to a contradiction, because Hegel believed that reason necessarily generates contradictions, as we will see, he thought new premises will indeed produce further contradictions. As he puts the argument, then, the skepticism that ends up with the bare abstraction of nothingness or emptiness cannot get any further from there, but must wait to see whether something new comes along and what it is in order to throw it too into the same empty abyss. So Hegel argues that because Plato's dialectics cannot get beyond arbitrariness and skepticism, it generates only approximate truths and falls short of being a genuine science. So actually, Hegel's has a model for these arguments of dialects. He proposes thesis, antithesis, and synthesis model. So, using dialect to strengthen ideas. So that's the idea of the dialect for this a model of Hegel's. So idea or thesis is systematically challenged antithesis. So the idea, it is the thesis. So the antithesis is the contradiction to the idea of the thesis. So incorporating this feedback creates a new thesis or synthesis. So the synthesis is actually like, in other words, it's a conclusion or the truth for the arguments of the thesis and antithesis. So this draws closer to truth with every iteration. So again, thesis is actually an idea. Antithesis is the contradictions of the idea of the thesis. So that is why if there is an antithesis, actually the thesis is just an idea. So if there is an antithesis, there is an argument between that two opponents. So argument happens to the situation. So there, here comes the synthesis, which puts or concludes or generates the idea of the thesis and antithesis. So, like the synthesis is the conclusions of the arguments of the thesis and antithesis. So, just for the example of the thesis, when someone argues that the water is a liquid, so that's the idea of the thesis, right? So we all know that the water is liquid. So before, actually before in the ancient times, I don't think that most of the people who are not educated knows that the water is liquid or knows about the liquid, gas, and solid. So, the idea of the thesis says that the water is liquid. So I would just think that someone is doesn't know anything about the liquid. Okay, so here comes the antithesis that contradicts the idea of the thesis that the water is not a liquid because it's a water. So why not? Why would they put another word for the water when the water is a water, right? So that's the antithesis. So like it actually doesn't happen in real life or in real situations that it most of the people argues about that one, but it's just an example for this model of Hegel. The example, the antithesis argues or contradicts the idea of the thesis, and there here comes the synthesis. The synthesis comes up with a new thesis. So it concludes or it generates the idea that the water is a liquid and also a gas. It depends on the temperature. Okay, so like of course, if there is a temperature 100% 100 degree Celsius temperature of the water, so it's in the boiling point. It evaporates and becomes a gas, right? We all know that it's on science. So um, if that's so, the synthesis concludes that it depends on the temperature. So here comes again the antithesis that argues that where we talking about the temperature if we are just talking about the water and liquid. I mean water, that's argues that the idea of the water is a liquid, right? So the antithesis contradicts again to the synthesis. So after the antithesis contradicts about the synthesis, there is an argument, right? So here comes again the synthesis. So the synthesis, we're not going to call this a thesis again because the thesis is an idea. So once there is a conclusion, we can say that this is synthesis. But if there is a contradiction to the synthesis, that is the new thesis. All right. So it's just an idea that if there is a contradictions to the idea of the synthesis, it is now a new thesis. So again, after that argument, here comes the synthesis that um, or for example, like in the antithesis argues that the synthesis says that it's actually depends on the temperature, and also the sea is a water, right? Oh, we all know that sea is a water. It's a liquid. I mean, the sea is a liquid. So if the sea is a liquid, then it is a water, right? So here comes the antithesis that how come the sea is water when it's salty? So if you can say that the water is liquid, um, how come the water is taste bland? So how come the sea that is salty um, becomes a liquid, right? So that's the antithesis. It's actually just an idea. Okay, so it's there's a contradiction again for the idea of the synthesis. That's where come out the new thesis. So if there's a contradiction for the synthesis, there's a thesis, and then it will again concludes for the synthesis, which is the final thesis. So for the conclusion, the liquid is, I mean, the water is liquid, and also a gas depends on the temperature, and also the sea is liquid because it's liquid, and we all know that, right? So it's actually just an example of the idea of Hegel's model, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And other philosophers contradicts to that idea, since it's not really practical, as we know that in real life it doesn't really, like, if there is an argument, I mean, if there is an idea, there's always a contradiction to the idea. It doesn't really applies in real life. So um, that is why this I think that this idea, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is not practical, because it doesn't applies in our everyday life, because there are other people that comes up with the idea, and another people agrees with that idea, so there is no contradiction with that certain idea, right? So um, just that it's my opinion of this Hegel's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis model. So next will be the next reporter. So just stay on watching this video. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vanjuro Lorente. I'm the next reporter of Group 7. So, we have here, why does Hegel use dialectics? Dialectics. Dialectics. So, we can begin to see why Hegel was motivated to use a dialectical method by examining the project he set for himself, particularly in relation to the works of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Hume had argued against what we can think of as the naive view of how we come to have scientific knowledge. According to the naive view, we can gain knowledge of the world by using our sense to pull the world into our heads, so to speak, although we may have to use careful observation and do experiments. Our knowledge of the world is basically a mirror or copy of what the world is like. Whom argue, however, that naive science claim that our knowledge corresponds to our copies what the world is like does not work. Take the scientific concept of ghost for instance. Next is, according to the concept of ghost, to say that one event causes another is to say that there is a necessary connection between the first event, the cause, and the second event, the effect, such that when the first event happens, the second event must also happen. According to naive science, when we claim or know that some event Some event cause some other event are claim mirrors or copies what the what the world is like. It follows that necessary causal connection between the two events must itself be out there in the world. However, Home argue we never observe any such necessary causal connection in our experience of the world, nor can we infer that one exists based on our reasoning. How did Hegel respond to Kant? Skepticism, especially since Hegel accepted Kant's Copernican revolution, or Kant's claim that we have knowledge of the world because of what we are like because of our reason. How far Hegel can we get out of our reason? How far Hegel can we get out of our heads to see the world as it is in itself? Hegel's answer is very close to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Response to Plato. Plato argued that we have knowledge of the world only through the forms. The forms are perfectly universal, rational concepts or ideas. Excuse me. Because the world is imperfect, however, Plato excelled the forms that their own realm, although things in the world get their definitions by participating in the forms. Those things are the best imperfection copies of the universe universal forms. He forms are therefore not in this world, but in a separate realm of their own. Aristotle argued, however, that the world is knowable not because things in the world are imperfect copies of the forms, but because of the forms are in the things themselves as the defining essence of those things. Next is Hegel's dialectical mythological. Scholars have often questioned whether Hegel's dialectical mythological. Scholars have often questioned whether Hegel's dialectical method is logical. Some of their skepticism grows out of the role that contradictions plays in his thought and argument, while many of the oppositions embedded in the dialectical development and definition of concepts or forms are not contradictions in the strict sense. Scholars such as Graham Priest have suggested that some of them are Hegel even holds against the Kant that there are contradictions not only in though but also in the world. Motion, for instance, Hegel says in an existent contradictions as he describes it. So next is angels on the dialectics of nature. In the dialectics of nature, angels aim to demonstrate the process of nature obey the same general laws of motion as social intellectual processes. As he wrote the anti-during angels survey mathematics and the natural sciences to convince himself that the welter of the innumerable changes taking place in nature. The same dialectical laws are in the operation as those which in history govern the apparent fortuitousness of events. The same laws as those which similarly form the thread running through the history of the development of human though and gradually raised to consequences in the mind of man, and which were first formulated by Hegel in mystical form before Marx and Engels refusion them into the materialist dialectic. Meanwhile, the new and higher stage of natural knowledge demanded a theoretical system and a method of though appropriate to itself. The old mechanical system of nature with its unchangeable laws and elements and its metaphysical mode of though operating with inflexible and exclusive categories no longer suffice. So it was a philosopher rather than a scientist who provided natural science with the intellectual means for its emancipation from the old outlook and for the construction of a new one. So just as Descartes had outlined the mechanical system of nature, so Hegel formulated the first systematic conception of the whole natural, social, and spiritual world as a continuous process of development. In his dialectical logic, Hegel attempted to give a rational form and evolve a rational method out of many-sided, a contradictory processes of evolution. The laws of his dialectic are nothing but the most general laws of motion and change in nature, society, and human law. These laws were originally conceived by Hegel in idealist fashion as mere laws of law, but as Marx and Engels subsequently demonstrated in their materialist version of dialectical logic. Dialectical laws are conceptual formulations of objective material realities. So these are this is our report of Group 7. So that's all. Thank you.